Welcome back to the Simulator series. In today's episode, we are going to be creating player title displays. So, hopping directly into Studio, the first thing that we're going to do is start off with creating the GUI, as I feel like we've done with so many episodes. Anyways, with that being said, we can actually give ourselves a head start because we've already created a GUI like this before. So, we're going to go inside of the replicated storage, and inside of here, we actually have a billboard GUI called Pet GUI. We're going to go ahead and copy that. Then what we want to do is go inside of the workspace. And more specifically, we want to locate a character model so that we can set this GUI up according to how a standard character model actually looks. Now, in your game, if you have the jump shot model, you should actually have my character in here, or maybe you replace this with your own character. Otherwise, if you don't have any characters in your game, there is actually an easy way to import one without even using a single plugin. All we have to do is actually go to the test tab, click on Reg Builder, and now if you're using device emulation, it might be hard to see this GUI because it appears really small. But basically, click the first button that appears here, which actually says My Avatar, and then once you click that, it will actually import your avatar into the workspace. So then we could drag this around a little bit, and now it's in a much better position where we can actually see it. So now that we have a standard character model, we're going to go inside of here and then select the head part. Then we're going to want to paste the pet GUI that we just copied directly inside of here by hitting Ctrl, Shift, and V. Now that we have the GUI inside of the head, we can actually see what it looks like. The first thing we want to do is adjust the property of this GUI, and that is the stud offset property. And we want to change that from 4.5 down to 3.5. We're also going to go ahead and rename the billboard GUI and call this player title GUI. We also want to modify one more property of the billboard GUI, and that is actually the clip descendants property. So let's go ahead and set that to false. And now this will allow GUI elements that are larger in size than the GUI and sort of go outside of the GUI's bounds to still be displayed, which is what we want. Of course, this might sound confusing, but as we get further into it, you'll see exactly what I'm talking about. So, with that being said, we're done with adjusting the billboard GUI. Let's go ahead and take a look inside of here. Inside of here, we have a frame, and we want to go inside of the frame. And inside of the frame, we have a couple of text labels. Now, we're going to go ahead and delete the rarity text label, and we should only have the pet and upgrade text label. We're actually going to want to swap these around, though. Realistically, the only difference I think between the two is maybe the size, but definitely the color. So realistically, we could just swap the properties, but I'm just going to go ahead and change the layout order. So we want the pet name to appear above the upgrade. So we're going to set the layout order of the pet name to -1. And now looking at the layout order of the upgrade text label, we're going to go ahead and set that to 1 so that it appears below or after the pet name text label. Then what we're going to do is actually rename the pet name text label to be called player. And since we've renamed that, let's go ahead and adjust the text of this to actually reflect our name. Now, my name being MonzterDEV, that's only 10 characters long, and the longest name on Roblox can actually be 20. So I'm going to go ahead and type my name 2 times, and we'll see what that actually looks like. And now that we see that, it's really hard to read because it's extremely small. Now, what we can do to make this look better is we can actually change the automatic size property, and we want to set that to X. Now that we've done that, I expected it to actually look a lot better, but we need to actually change one more property to make this actually look how it should. And that's actually a property inside of the UI list layout. We want to actually adjust the horizontal alignment property and set that to center. Now that we've set that to center, we can actually see both of the text labels are actually centered in this frame. If you have the horizontal alignment set to like left or right, you get this really weird effect, which I did not imagine or think would happen at all. But yeah, that's pretty interesting. Anyway, we want to set the horizontal alignment to center. Now that we've done that, let's go back to the player text label. And now we can visually see the difference between using X automatic size or none. When we use none, the text gets shrunken down extremely small when we use a very long string. But if we set automatic size to X, now we can actually look at the absolute size property to really see what is going on here. When we have the automatic size set to none, the absolute size of this text label is actually 342 pixels. Now, if we set automatic size to X, the X of the absolute size actually changes to 1,124. But of course, the size of the Y-axis remains the same. So that's how we can easily accommodate for longer names. Now that we've done that, let's go to the upgrade text label, and we're actually going to rename this to be called title. Now, for the text of this, I'm going to say something like new clicker. And then I'll set the text color to something boring because this will be kind of the first boring and basic rank that the player gets when they first join their game. So I'll set it to like a basic gray color. And if we want to, we can change the automatic size on here as well if you expect to have long titles. So I'll change the automatic size to X, and now we can see that that appears nicer as well. And going back to our billboard frame, remember when I said that we wanted to disable the clip descendants property? That is because we're using the automatic sizing. And when we actually select the billboard GUI, it might be hard to see, but there is a little blue outlined rectangle displayed. And that is basically showing us the bounds of which this billboard GUI contains. So if we were to enable the clips descendants property, we can see that everything outside of this outline has been cut off. So that's why we want to disable the clips descendant property so that we can still see all the text which goes beyond the billboard GUI. With that being said, we're actually done with creating this. So what we can do is go ahead and drag this and store this inside of the server storage. Now, before we can begin scripting, there's one more thing that we need to do sort of inside of the workspace. If we look at the character model that I imported, we can actually see the word rig displayed over it. It might be a little bit hard to see because we're using device emulation, but we can definitely see something is displaying over top of their head. And this is basically Roblox's default name display. Now, since we're using our own form of displaying the player's name, we don't want to use Roblox's name display, so we want to hide that from players so that we can basically replace it with our own. Now, how can we hide this from players? Well, it's actually pretty simple. All we have to do is select the starter player service and look for one of the first properties, which should be called name display distance. Then we can set this to 0, and once we set that to 0, the name display will no longer be seen by any players. Now, of course, we still see the name right here, but that's because it's an already imported model. When we customize settings of the starter player service, that only applies to things that happen actually inside of the game when it's playing. So we're going to go ahead and delete the rig that we imported to test all this out on, and then we can go ahead and collapse the workspace. So to begin scripting, we're going to go ahead and actually update the island's config. So we're going to go inside of the replicated storage, inside of the configs folder, and open up the island's module script. Inside of here, we have a table called config, and we have listed each of the individual islands with some properties like price and requirement. And now what we want to do is add another property to each of these tables, which is going to be called title. And the value of this will be a string, and more specifically, the string that we want to display as the player's title whenever they unlock this specific island. So for instance, I'm going to go ahead and call this one Foraging Clicker. And now that we've set that property, I'm going to go ahead and copy this. Then we'll go down to the Arctic island, and we can go ahead and paste in the title property from above. For this title, I'm going to go ahead and say Frosty Clicker. We'll go ahead and copy it again, go down to Volcano, paste it once again. This time, we'll go with Volcanic Clicker. For Moon, we'll go with Lunar Clicker. For Mars, we'll go with Martian Clicker. And finally, for the Sun, we're going to go with Solar Clicker. And now I've added a title to each of the individual islands. So with that being said, there's one more thing that we need to do inside of this module script, and that's going to be creating a brand new function. This is going to be a shared function, which is going to be called getFurthestUnlockedIsland, and that'll go ahead and accept the player's data. Now with this function, what we want to determine is what is the furthest island that the player has unlocked. And to make this as easy to understand as possible, what I'm referring to by furthest island is basically how much have they progressed in our game. So if they've unlocked the forest island and the Arctic island, but they haven't unlocked the volcano island, then the furthest island would be Arctic, for example. And of course, we'll use this function because then we'll set the title to Frosty Clicker, as that is the latest island that they have unlocked, aka the furthest they've progressed. So going back to this function, what we're going to do is create a variable called Furthest Island. And by default, we're going to go ahead and set that to spawn. Next, what we want to do is loop through all of the islands in a very specific order. So we're going to say for_island in islands.island order do. Of course, the island order is a variable we've created before. It's just an array of all the different islands that are in our game in a very specific order of which ones come first to last. So as we're looping through this list, what we want to do is we want to check if the player owns that specific island. And we can do that by using the function directly above this, which is called isIslandUnlocked. So we're going to create a variable called isIslandUnlocked, which is going to be equal to islands.isIslandUnlocked. And we're going to go ahead and pass through the player's data as well as the specific island. Now that we've determined if the island is unlocked or not, what we're going to do is if the island is unlocked, then we're going to go ahead and set the furthest island variable to the island that the player has unlocked. Then we want to use an else if, and we want to check if isIslandUnlocked equals false. Because if it does equal false, then we want to go ahead and stop the for loop right there. Now, the reason that we're checking if it equals false instead of saying something like not is island unlocked is because at first we set the value of furthest island to spawn. When we pass through spawn to the isIslandUnlock function, that's actually going to return to us nil. So that means that the loop will break instantly because we don't actually include the spawn island inside of player's data because it's unlocked automatically for everybody. So because we get nil returned here, if we said else if not is island unlocked, then that would be triggered by either nil or false. So that's why we're being very specific here and only checking if it's false, and that's when we actually want to break the loop instead of doing it when it's either nil or false. With that being said, we're done with that for loop. After that for loop has finished, what we're going to do is go ahead and return the furthest island variable that we created earlier. And make sure you spell the word return correctly. Now that we've done that, we're actually done inside of this module script, so we can go ahead and close out of that. Now there's one more module script that we want to update inside of the configs folder, and that is actually the world's module script. So let's go inside of here. And now inside of here, we have the config variable once again, and then we have a config table for both of our worlds. We're going to add another property to this table, and we're going to call this title color. We're going to set that equal to a color 3. And like I said, for our first title, our default one, I'm actually going to go ahead and set that to a gray. Then when the player has the Atlantis world unlocked, we'll go ahead and make that a nice light blue. Now that we've added the title color properties to both of the worlds, the next thing we want to do is create a function for getting the furthest world that the player has unlocked, just like we did with islands. So we're going to go down towards the bottom of the script. We're going to go ahead and call this function get furthest unlocked world. For the parameter, we're going to go ahead and accept the player's data. And now the first thing we're going to do inside of here is create a variable called furthest world and set that equal to spawn. Then we're going to go ahead and loop through all of the worlds. So we'll say in worlds.worldOrder do, and now we'll create a variable called does own. And how do we determine if the player owns the world or not? We can go ahead and use the does player own requirement function. So we'll say worlds.does player own requirement, pass through the player's data, and pass through the specific world. And now if the player does own the island, then what are we going to do? Well, we'll go ahead and set the furthest world variable equal to that world. And because of how the does player own requirement function is actually set up, we won't have to worry about checking for false here, so we can just use an else statement. And if the player does not own the world, then we can go ahead and break right there. And now after we're done with that for loop, we're going to go ahead and return the furthest world variable, similar to how we did previously. And now with that being said, we're done with this module script as well, so we can go ahead and close out of that. And now the next thing that we want to do is actually create another config module script inside of here for the titles. So we're going to go ahead and add another module script inside of here. We'll go ahead and call this titles. We'll rename the module variable to be called shared. And now the first thing we want to do inside of here is actually require both the islands and worlds configs. So we're going to create a variable called islands config, which is going to be equal to require. And now we could make a variable for the replicated storage, or we could just say script.parent.islands, and that is completely fine to do as well. You don't always have to require the replicated storage, but you definitely can if you want to. With that being said, we now have the islands config. Let's go ahead and get the worlds config just like that. Now that we have both of these, the first thing that we're going to do is actually create a shared function. This function is actually going to be called get title from island. And for the parameter, we're going to go ahead and accept the island, which is going to be a string. Now, inside of this function, all we're going to do is say return, and then we're going to go inside of the islands config, inside of the config table, index that with the specific island, and then return the title property that's inside of it. And that's all that we're going to do with this function. We're going to go ahead and copy and paste this because we also want to do this for the world as well. Instead of saying get title from island though, we're going to say get color and now from world. Then for the parameter, we'll say world instead of island. And now what do we want to return? Well, we'll use the world's config. We'll go inside of the config variable, index that with the specific world, and then go ahead and return the title color property. And oh yeah, make sure you spell the word world correctly, not pearled, I guess. I don't even know how you would say that. Anyways, we want to go ahead and create one more shared function inside of here, which is going to be called get title. And this is going to accept the player's data. Now, the first thing we're going to do inside of here is determine the player's furthest island. So we're going to create a variable called furthest island. And how do we get that? Well, we can use the function we just created inside of the islands config called get furthest unlocked island. Then we can go ahead and pass through the data. And now if furthest island equals spawn, then what we want to do is we actually want to return new clicker. And now the reason that I'm saying that is because we're actually going to use the get title from island function. But first we needed to get the furthest island that the player has unlocked. So if furthest island is set to spawn and we were to pass that to the get title from island function, then that would result in an error because we're trying to index the config with an island that's not stored inside of there, and then we're indexing nil with title, which would throw an error. So that's why we're creating this if statement right here. Now below that if statement, we know that we actually got a specific island that the player has unlocked. So we're going to create a variable called title, and then we'll go ahead and use the shared function that we just created called get title from island and pass through the furthest island. Then we can go ahead and return the title variable just like that. And with that being said, that's all we're going to do inside of this module script. So we can go ahead and close out of this and the islands module script if you had that still open as well. Now that we've created that config and updated the other ones, the next thing we're going to do is actually begin scripting this on the server side. So we're going to go inside of the server script service, and inside of here, we're actually going to go ahead and create a module script. Now we're going to rename this module script to be called titles, and we'll rename the module variable to be called shared. And inside of here, we want to create a couple of variables for a few services. So we want to create a variable for the server script service, the server storage, and finally, the replicated storage. Now that we've created a variable for all of those, we want to go ahead and require a few module scripts. So of course, the first one that we want to require is the titles config. And how do we get that? Well, we'll use require inside of the replicated storage, inside of configs folder, we have the titles module script. Now we're going to want to require another config module script, and that's actually going to be the world's config. So let's go ahead and create a variable for that. Then we want to go ahead and create a variable for the player data manager inside of the server script service. So we'll create a variable called player data, and we'll say require server script service dot player data manager, just like that. And finally, we want to go ahead and create a variable for the player title billboard GUI that we created and stored inside of the server storage. So we'll create a variable called title GUI, which is going to be equal to server storage dot player title GUI, just like that. And now we can go ahead and begin creating some functions. So we're going to go ahead and create a shared function, which is going to be called update player title. And it's going to have a single parameter, which is going to be the player. Now, this function's name is a little bit misleading because it's going to both update and also create a player title if one does not already exist for the player. So when it comes to doing anything with the player's title, the first thing we need to make sure of is we have access to the player's character. So we're going to create a variable called character. And to get the player's character, we can simply index the player object with the character property. Now, if the character doesn't exist, so we're going to use the keyword or, we can then wait for the player's character to actually exist by saying player.characterAdded. That gives us access to the character added event, and then we can use the wait method on this, which will eventually return a model to us. Now, just in case we don't have the player's character, then we want to go ahead and stop the function right there. Now that we've gotten the player's character model, we want to get the part inside of that model called head so that we can store the GUI inside of it. So we're going to create a variable called head, and we're going to set the type of this to part because Roblox is not going to be able to infer the specific type of this variable. And now to get the player's head, we're going to say character, and then we'll use the wait for child method just in case the head does not exist yet. And then the child that we're going to wait for is called head. Now, if we don't get a head, then we're going to go ahead and stop the function right there. And now that we've gotten all of the physical parts of the player's character that we need, the next thing that we need to do is actually access the player's data. So let's go ahead and get their profile. We can do that by using the player's data manager, more specifically the profiles variable, and then indexing that with the specific player. Now, if we don't get the player's profile, then we're going to stop the function right there. Now that we've gotten the player's data, we first want to determine what the furthest world the player has unlocked. So we'll create a variable called furthest world. And now how do we determine the furthest world that the player has unlocked? Well, we'll use the world's config, more specifically the get furthest unlocked world function, and then simply pass through the data of the profile. Now let's go ahead and create a variable for the new title. And how do we actually get the title? Well, we can use the title config, more specifically the get title function. And all we have to do is pass through the profile data once again. And now the last bit of information that we need to get is actually the color of the title that we want to change it to based on whichever world the player has unlocked. So we're going to go ahead and create a variable called title color. And how can we get that? Well, by using the titles config once again, more specifically the get color from world function. And then we'll go ahead and pass through the furthest world that the player has unlocked. Now that we've gotten all the information, we're almost ready to use it, but we need to go ahead and get the title GUI. And what I mean by get the title GUI is, well, first, before we just instantly add it to the player, since this function is called update player title, and like I said originally, we want to both update or add it to the player if it doesn't already exist. So the first thing that we have to do is determine if it already exists on the player or not. So we're going to create a variable called title GUI. And how can we determine if the title GUI actually exists already? Well, we can look inside of the head. So we can use find first child on this, and we can look for a GUI called player title GUI. Now, if the title GUI does not actually exist, then we're going to go ahead and create one and add it to the player's head. So we'll say title GUI equals title GUI, and make sure that you're differentiating the capitalization in these variables. We probably should have renamed one of them something different, but yeah, you know. Anyways, with this GUI, because we're adding it to the player, we're going to go ahead and clone it. And now that we've cloned it, we're going to go ahead and parent that to the player's character's head. And now we've added that to the player. The next thing that we need to do is update the text labels inside of the title GUI. So we'll say title GUI dot frame dot player, and then we'll set the text property of the player text label to the player's name. So player.name. You can also choose to set it to the display name as well if you'd like to do that, but I'm going to go ahead and just set it to their name. We also need to update the text of the title text label inside of here as well, so I'm going to go ahead and copy and paste that. Then we'll say title.text. And what are we going to set the title to? Well, their brand new title, which is actually the title variable. And now we need to do one more thing with the title text label, which is actually adjusting the text color 3 property. And we're going to go ahead and set that to the title color property that we created earlier as well. And that's all that we're going to do inside of this function. So when we call this function, we're getting the player's character, then we're getting their head, then we're getting their data. Once we get their data, we determine the furthest world that the player has unlocked, we determine what the title should actually say, and then we determine what color it should actually be. Because this function is used both for creating and updating the title, and the reason that I did this is because it really helps organize the code and keep it all inside of a single function, and it saves us time by preventing us from having to rewrite a bunch of code. So that's why I like doing it this way, even if some people might feel like it's a little bit less organized, which I could probably agree with. Because of how small this function actually is, I think the small organizational loss is completely worth it, and honestly just not even an issue in this circumstance. Anyway, since we're both creating and updating in the same function, the first thing we need to do is check if we already created it for this character. So if we already created it and it's already inside of there, then we're just going to set the variable to it just like that. But if we didn't, then we're going to go ahead and create it and add it to the player's head. And then after all of that, no matter if we did create it or if we didn't create it, its text labels will go ahead and be updated with both the text and the text color. So that's all that we got to do inside of that function. Now let's go ahead and actually use it. Now, when are we going to actually use that function? Well, we're going to go ahead and use the player data because we have the profile loaded event. Now we have to say .event, and then we're going to go ahead and connect to that event. And what is that event going to pass through to us? Well, it's going to go ahead and pass us a player. So now when this event is fired off for the first time, what we want to do is actually go ahead and call the update player title function and pass through the player. In addition to that though, we also need to do this every single time the player's character respawns. So every single time the player dies and different things like that, basically their character will be reset. It'll pretty much just be deleted from the workspace and everything will be removed from it. And then eventually the model will be added back to the workspace, but it won't contain any of the things that we stored inside of it. So we have to re-add those things once the player's character has respawned. Now the important thing here is, how do we determine when the player's character has respawned? Well, the player object actually has an event attached to it called character added. So we can go ahead and connect to that. Now we're going to go ahead and create an anonymous function inside of here. We don't actually care about having a parameter for this function because all we're going to do is actually go ahead and call the update player title function and pass through the player. And there we go. This is when we're going to go ahead and call the function, both when the player joins the game and then every single time their character respawns after that as well. And with that being said, that's all that we're going to do inside of the script, so we can go ahead and close it out. With that being said though, we're not done with scripting because another thing that we need to do is actually script in updating the player's title whenever they've unlocked a brand new island or world. Along with that, since we created titles as a module script, it also needs to be required so that it actually runs as well. Otherwise, those events will not be connected to the function and nothing will actually happen. So let's go inside of the islands module script, and inside of here, we're going to go ahead and require it. So after the islands config and before the remotes variable, we'll go ahead and get the titles module, and then we'll rename this variable to be called titles manager. And now what we're going to do is go down to the unlock island function and go all the way down to after we actually unlock the island and even replicate it to the client and after we award the badge as well. Although we could probably put it before the award badge, it doesn't matter, but it does need to be after we actually set the player's data and change it to reflect that they have unlocked the island. So now that we've actually updated the player's data, we can go ahead and use the titles manager and use the update player title function and just pass through the player. And now once we do that, it'll go ahead and update the player's title. And now because of how we have the world system set up, that's actually all that we have to do. So yeah, we're fully finished with implementing this, so we can go ahead and close out of the script. Now that we're finished this, you of course can go ahead directly into your game and test this out. But I want to actually test this out with 2 clients just to make sure that everything is actually working as we intended for it. So I'm going to go to the test tab, I'm going to make sure that I set the amount of clients to 2, and then I'm going to go ahead and click start. So when I load into the game for the first time, I can actually see that these are being displayed as they should be. We have our names being displayed here and the first title displayed, which is new clicker with that kind of ugly gray color. I don't know if it's our best idea to use the worst color at first because that might be too bad. But anyway, let's go ahead and unlock our first island. When we unlock our first island, we can see that the title has actually been updated to Foraging Clicker. Then let's go ahead and unlock the Arctic Island. When we unlock that, we now have Frosty Clicker. Now give me a minute, then we'll unlock the Volcano Island. I have finally achieved 10,000 clicks. Don't ask me how long that took. Anyway, unlocking the Volcano Island. By now, we can see our title has been updated to say Volcanic Clicker as well as the color because we now have actually unlocked the next world, which is Atlantis over here. So yeah, that's all working good. Let's go ahead and test respawning with our character because like I said, when the character respawns, we need to re-add it to the character, and we can see that when we do that, it has actually updated. Additionally, I'm now viewing it from the other client that we had launched, and we can see that it is all being replicated perfectly. Anyways, ladies and gentlemen, with all that being said, we're finally done with implementing the player titles. As always, if you did enjoy the video, make sure you smash the like button, and if you want to support me, get access to all the scripts and the game file that we created in today's video, and gain access to a ton of assets that you can use to easily create your next Roblox game, then you can visit MonzterDEV or my Patreon to support me and get all of those things. Anyways, as always, I hope that you guys have a great day, and I'll see you guys in the next video.